Hello, and welcome back to Creepy Chronicles. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from. I love reading every single one. If you enjoy Creepy Chronicles filled with spine-chilling horror, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now get comfortable. Dim the lights if you dare. Relax your mind. Let the outside world fade away. And let's begin. Story 1. 3 weeks ago, I buried my father. Next weekend, I'm driving back to the river where we used to go fishing when I was a child. And before I do, I need to write down what happened there. I did not meet my father until I was 9 years old. He and my mother got married after they found out she was pregnant. And then they divorced not long after I was born. She was 17 and he was 20. And I have to imagine neither of them was remotely prepared for the responsibility of raising a baby. I was 31 when my own son was born, old enough to have money saved up, old enough to have already made most of my worst mistakes. And even then, the stress of having a newborn still put hairline cracks in my marriage. I do not say that to excuse my father. I say it because I am not sure I would have done any better if I had been in his position at that age. My mother took full custody after the divorce and moved me all the way across the country from Ontario to British Columbia. I grew up in Kelowna, right along the Okanagan Valley. My father would still call us every couple of months to check in. I remember holding the phone and knowing that I was supposed to feel something. This was my father. I understood that concept, but I did not have anything real to attach it to. He was a voice that called every now and then, abstract in the way that grief is abstract before you have actually lost someone. The word father existed in my head, but it had no weight behind it. It was just a word. A few weeks before I turned 9, my mother ended her relationship with a man she had been seeing. He did not take it well. He began to stalk us. One night, after we were all asleep, he broke in through the front door of our apartment. I woke up to the sound of screaming. But by the time I scrambled out of bed and made it to the hallway, the apartment had gone completely silent. I saw him sitting in the chair in our living room. He was completely still, holding something in his lap that I could not make out in the dark. My mother was pressed against the far wall. Neither of them was moving. I stood there frozen in my pajamas, trapped in that terrible, heavy silence. I do not know how many minutes passed like that before the police finally banged on the door. It turned out that one of our neighbors had seen him breaking in and had called the cops, and I understand now that it was the only thing that saved us that night. The next morning, my mother bought 2 one-way tickets to Ontario. We packed our entire lives into suitcases and were out of Kelowna by the end of the week. When we landed, my father was waiting at the arrivals gate. He hurried over to pull us into a clumsy and desperate embrace. He smelled like stale coffee and the sharp tang of nicotine. I wrapped my arms around him mechanically, pressing my cheek against the jacket of the man I only knew as a voice through a telephone. We moved into his mother's house in a small city on the edge of Lake Simcoe. It was an old brick bungalow that backed onto a steep and overgrown ravine. My father and I were strangers performing a relationship that neither of us knew the shape of yet. He taught me things: how to change a tire, how to read a circuit breaker, the proper way to shake someone's hand. He was always good at practical things. He could fix almost anything, explain almost any mechanical problem in a way that made it seem simple. But when it came to conversation, to the kind of emotional back and forth that fathers and sons are supposed to have, he was lost, and so was I. My father was also big into fishing. Every Sunday morning, you would find him parked in front of the television, watching his favorite fishing shows. He watched all of them religiously, every episode, every season. A lot of those shows were filmed on lakes and rivers not far from where we lived, which I think made them feel more real to him, more personal. One morning, there was an episode where two fishermen were angling for smallmouth bass on the Magnetawan River near a town called Burke's Falls. I was sitting on the couch eating cereal when I noticed my father's face change. His eyes lit up in a way I had never seen before, like he had recognized an old friend from across a crowded room. He grabbed a cigarette carton from the coffee table, tore off a flap from the cardboard, and wrote something on the back of it. Then he folded it up and tucked it into his wallet. The next weekend, we were up at 5 in the morning, thermoses of coffee wedged between the seats of his truck, driving north in the dark toward a river he had seen on television. The drive took about an hour and a half. He had a binder full of CDs in the console between the seats. Mostly old heavy metal and punk bands, and a few others I did not recognize. We did not talk much. Every now and then he would skip ahead to a song he liked and turn the volume up slightly, and I would nod, and that small exchange was enough to fill the silence in the cab of his truck, without either of us having to say anything real. I was 9 years old, and I did not know what to ask him. I am not sure he knew what to offer me. So we sat together and let the music take the place of the conversation we were not sure how to have. We reached the river just as the sky was beginning to lighten. It was not a real sunrise. There was no color, no drama. It was more like the darkness lifting by a couple of degrees the way it does under low cloud cover. The light came through flat and gray, and there were no shadows anywhere. The water was the same dull color as the sky above it, so still and smooth that it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. He parked on a gravel pull-off near the bank, and we unloaded our gear in silence. I remember smelling the river before I actually saw it. Cold water, mud, the faint mineral smell of wet rock that has not seen sunlight in a long time. He set me up along the shoreline and crouched down beside me to show me how to tie a lure. His hands were quick and confident in a way the rest of him was not. He installed fencing for a living, and the work had done decades' worth of damage to his body in a fraction of that time. Most mornings I would catch him hunched over the kitchen counter swallowing aspirin by the handful, grimacing as he tried to straighten out his back. But here on this river, there was a youthfulness to him, an energy that I associated with the place itself. It was like the river was giving something back to him, returning a piece of him that the rest of his life kept taking away. I was watching his fingers work the line when he said, "Now you try," and I looked up from the lure for the first time since we had arrived. That is when I saw the man across the river. He was standing at the tree line on the opposite shore. Maybe 40 feet of gray water separated us. He was dressed for fishing. He wore a full smock, the old-fashioned kind. The sort of thing you might see in a photograph from a different decade. But he was not fishing. He had no rod, no tackle box, no gear of any kind that I could see. He was just standing there at the very edge of the trees where the shadow of the canopy still held, which made him difficult to look at directly. He was like a shape in a dark room that resists focus, something your eyes slide off of no matter how hard you try to pin it down. He was completely still, and he was facing our side of the river. I had seen a man be that still once before, in our living room in Kelowna. I assumed at first that he was waiting for something, a fishing buddy maybe, or for the light to get better, but he did not move, not his hands, not his weight from one foot to the other. None of the small, unconscious adjustments that a human body makes when it is standing in one place. He was perfectly and unnaturally motionless, like a photograph of a person, rather than the person themselves. I could not make out his face clearly from across the water, but I had the very distinct feeling that he could make out ours. I finished tying the lure badly, and my father leaned over to fix it without saying anything. I kept watching the man across the river the whole time. "There's a guy over there," I said. My father looked up. He found the man in the tree line without any trouble at all, as if he already knew roughly where to look. He held his gaze there for a moment. It was longer than a glance, but shorter than a stare. And then he looked back down at my line. "Don't worry about it," he told me. It was the same voice he used for everything. The same flat and even tone he used to tell me to put my seatbelt on, or to keep my elbows off the table. It gave me nothing. But I had been watching my father all morning the way you watch a person you are trying to learn. I was cataloging everything: the way he moved, the way he held his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened when he was thinking about something he did not want to say out loud. And in the half-second before the mask came back down over his face, I had seen something. He knew him. We fished until early afternoon, and the man stood in the tree line the entire time. He did not sit down. He did not shift his weight. He did not leave. He just stood there facing us, motionless, for hours. I desperately wanted to leave. I wanted to get away from this river and from the unmoving fishermen watching us from the opposite shore. I was frustrated with my father. I could not understand why he was not bothered by this. He was treating it with the same nonchalance he treated his joint pain, as if it were just another discomfort that could be suppressed with a handful of pills and some willful ignorance. While I was packing up my gear, I watched my father do something I did not understand. He waded out to a flat rock near the middle of the river. He moved carefully because the current was not strong, but his knees were bad, and every step looked like it cost him something. When he reached the rock, he set something down on it. I could not see what it was from where I was standing. Then he waded back to shore, picked up his rod, and we loaded the truck. The drive home followed the same pattern as the drive there. He put on a CD, and we did not talk. But the silence on the way home was a different kind of silence. On the way to the river, it had been two people who did not know each other. On the way back, it was two people who had agreed, without ever discussing it, not to talk about something that had happened. That night I was lying in bed when a smell moved through my room. It was faint at first, so faint I thought I might be imagining it. But then it grew stronger. It was the same damp mineral smell from the river, cold water and mossy rock and the green scent of things that never see sunlight. My stomach tied itself into a knot, and for a few seconds I just lay there with my heart beating fast, trying to make sense of it. Then I remembered that I had left my still wet fishing clothes on the floor next to my bed. I rolled over and picked up my shirt and brought it to my face. It gave off that same earthy river smell, and I let out a long sigh of relief. I tossed the shirt back onto the floor and rolled over to go to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound coming from outside. It was soft and rhythmic, the slow pull and release of something moving through wet ground. A squelching, patient sound, like the mud from the riverbank had followed us home and was now working its way across the backyard, one careful step at a time. I lay completely still and listened. A dog, I told myself. Dogs got loose in the neighborhood all the time. Strays would wander through the yard at night, knocking over trash cans and rooting through the garden. But dogs do not move like that. A dog trots and stops and snuffles and doubles back. This was even. Step, Pause. Step. The pacing was too slow, too deliberate, too purposeful. It was coming from the direction of the ravine behind the house. I did the math a 9-year-old does in the dark, calculating distances in my head, without really knowing what I was calculating. How far the tree line was from the back fence. How far the fence was from the house. How far the house was from my bedroom wall. I listened to the sound close that distance one unhurried step at a time. Step. Pause. Step. Whatever it was did not hesitate at the fence. It did not pause or wander or change direction. It moved in a perfectly straight line across the lawn, and I tracked its progress by sound alone as the squelching footsteps crossed the wet grass and came closer and closer to the house until they stopped right outside my bedroom wall. Then absolute silence. I counted to 30 in my head. Then I counted to 30 again. The house settled around me, making the particular creaks and exhales that old buildings make in the middle of the night, but I could not hear any breathing from outside. No movement, no footsteps, nothing. I had almost convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing when the silence changed. It was not the sound of movement. It was a faint and steady trickling against the window behind me, like water running slowly down the siding of the house, slow and steady and patient. I stared at the ceiling and did not move. I became aware that I was holding my breath, and I let it out as quietly as I possibly could. The curtain over my window was thin, and the window was directly behind me. I would have only needed to roll over to see whatever was on the other side of the glass. I made a very deliberate decision not to do that. Whatever was out there stood in that spot for a long time. I do not know how long. Minutes that felt like hours. I lay there and thought about the fisherman from earlier that day, standing motionless in his smock on the opposite shore of the river, and I wondered if this was the same kind of stillness. Then I heard the sound of my window slowly sliding open. The old aluminum frame groaned against itself, metal scraping against metal, and cold air moved into the room. It carried the smell from the river with it, the mud, the mineral cold, the green rot at the water's edge. I felt it cross my face like a hand that did not quite touch me, close enough to feel but never making contact. I still did not turn over. I lay there until the first hint of morning light began to seep through the thin curtain. At some point during the night, the smell had faded, and the air in my room had returned to normal. When I finally worked up the courage to move, I checked my bedroom window. It was shut tightly. The latch was turned the way I always left it. Everything looked exactly the way it had when I went to bed. I told myself it must have been a dream. A very vivid and very detailed dream brought on by the strange day at the river and the unfamiliar smells and the man in the tree line. But then I looked down and noticed something on the hardwood floor beneath my window. It was a single boot print. It was already drying by the time I found it, the moisture evaporating in the morning warmth, leaving behind just a faint outline of something that had been wet. The shape was distorting as it dried, the edges softening and blurring into the grain of the wood, but it was unmistakably a footprint, a boot, large. I looked out my window. In the distance, at the tree line where my backyard ended and the steep ravine began, I saw him, the fisherman. He was standing the same way he had stood across the river the day before, impossibly still. No acknowledgement of the cold morning air, dressed in the same old-fashioned smock, facing the same direction, facing the house, facing my window. It was as if he had simply been relocated, like a chess piece someone had picked up and moved to a new square on the board. I ran to get my father. I told him there was a man in the backyard. the same man we had seen yesterday at the river. He looked at me for a moment in the thin morning light, and then he got up without saying anything. The fact that he did not tell me I was imagining things, the fact that he did not dismiss it, or laugh it off, or tell me to go back to bed, frightened me more than anything else could have. He checked the backyard. He walked the perimeter of the house. He checked the side yard and the fence line. Then he came back inside and told me there was nobody there. We went back to the Magnetawan River 3 more times that summer, and the routine never changed. The fisherman was always there. Same spot on the opposite shore. Same absolute stillness. His old smock cutting a dark silhouette against the trees behind him. He never moved closer to the water. He never crossed the river. He never had to. His presence alone was enough. It filled the space between us like something solid, something you could almost reach out and touch hanging in the air over that gray water. And after every single trip, the routine followed us home. The wet, heavy steps would cross the backyard in the hours before dawn, moving slowly and deliberately from the direction of the ravine toward the house, anchoring at the edge of the tree line by first light. By the time my father woke up and checked, there was never anyone there. I stopped reporting it after the second time. I just started checking the window latch instead, pressing my thumb against it every night before bed to make sure it was locked, even though I was no longer sure that a lock made any difference. On those later trips to the river, I watched my father more carefully than I had before. The ritual at the end of each fishing day became something I expected. He would always wade out to that same flat rock near the middle of the river and leave something behind on its surface. He would place it carefully, almost reverently, and then wade back to shore without looking at it again. Once, while he was loading gear into the truck after a trip, I snuck back down to the riverbank to check the rock before we left. It was already empty. The gray stone was bone dry, as if nothing had ever been placed on it. Whatever he had left there had been taken, and taken quickly. On our final trip of the summer, I watched him place a specific lure on the rock. It was a red and white casting spoon, the kind that catches even the flattest light. It almost seemed to glow against the gray stone. He did not turn back toward shore immediately this time. Instead, he stood there on the rock with his back to me, facing the opposite shore, and the tree line where the fisherman stood in his usual spot. He stayed like that for a long and silent moment, as if he were waiting for a signal that I could not see. Or maybe he was saying something. Or maybe he was just standing there because he did not know what else to do. Then he turned around, waded back to shore, picked up his rod, and we drove home in the dark. I did not have the vocabulary at 9 years old for what I was watching. I did not have the words to describe what I felt or the framework to make sense of any of it. But I understood in the way that children understand things before they have words for them. I understood that my father had some kind of arrangement with something. That the trips to this river were not just fishing trips. That they were not only for my benefit. That whatever was standing in that tree line across the water knew my father long before he ever started bringing me along. The trip stopped after that summer. I never found out why. He did not explain, and I did not ask. By that point in our relationship, I had learned which of my father's silences were walls and which were doors, and this particular silence had no handle on my side. It was sealed shut, and I knew instinctively that no amount of pushing or asking would open it. We never talked about the river again. I spent 23 years not thinking about it. That is not quite the right way to put it. I did not forget. You do not forget something like that. It was more like I filed it away in a part of my brain that I did not visit. A room in the back of the house that I kept the door closed on. I went to school. I got a job. I got married. I had a son of my own. I built a life that had nothing to do with rivers or fishermen or boot prints on hardwood floors. And for 23 years, that was enough. Then my father died. I was standing in his kitchen a few days after the funeral, going through the things he had left behind. It is a strange thing, sorting through a dead person's belongings. Every object carries a charge, a small jolt of recognition that connects you to a moment or a memory you had forgotten you were carrying. His reading glasses on the nightstand, his coffee mug in the sink, still unwashed, the particular way he folded his dish towels. His wallet was on the counter next to his keys, right where he always left them. I do not know why I picked it up. Force of habit, maybe. Or maybe there was still a part of me, even after all those years, that wanted to be closer to him. That wanted to understand him in a way I never had while he was alive. I opened it. Behind his driver's license, which was worn soft at the edges from years of being handled, I found a small piece of folded cardboard. I pulled it out and unfolded it carefully. It was the torn flap from a cigarette carton, the same one from all those years ago. He had kept it in his wallet for over 2 decades. There was writing on it, in his handwriting, tight and practical, the same way he did everything. No flourishes, no wasted strokes, just information. There was a name, and below it, in smaller letters, the name of the river. I stood in my father's kitchen for a long time, holding that small piece of cardboard. I thought about the way his eyes had lit up that morning watching the fishing show, the way he had scribbled something down and tucked it away before I could see what it was. I had assumed at the time that he was writing down directions, the name of a river he wanted to find, a place he wanted to visit. But standing there in his kitchen with the piece of cardboard in my hand, I realized something that changed the shape of everything I thought I understood about those trips. I do not think he needed directions. I think he already knew exactly where the river was. I think he had always known. My eyes settled on the name he had written down, the name above the river, and a cold feeling moved through my chest. It was my mother's name. I'm going back to the Magnetawan River next weekend. I need to see if the fisherman is still there. I need to understand what my father was leaving on that rock and why. I need to know what the arrangement was and whether it ended when he died, or whether it is still waiting there in the tree line on the opposite shore, patient and still, the way it has always been. I will let you know what I find. Story 2. I do not know where else to share this story. We just got back this morning, and my hands have not stopped shaking since we walked through the front door. Gio has not said a single word to me since last night. Not a whisper, not a sigh, nothing. If anyone reading this knows anything about the deep woods northeast of Saint-Donat, out in the remote parts of Quebec, please listen to me. I need to get this out of my head, and I need someone to tell me what to do. I am the kind of person who makes a spreadsheet for a camping trip. I know exactly how that sounds. Gio never lets me forget it either. He actually took a screenshot of my camping checklist once and sent it to his sister without any caption, just to watch me suffer while they made fun of me. But listen, when you are driving 4 hours northeast of Montreal into wild, empty land with absolutely no cell service, no park rangers, and no one who knows exactly where you are, you want to be prepared. You want the person who packed the emergency first aid kit to also be the person who checked the weather forecast and looked at the map. That is just common sense. It is basic survival. We found our camping spot on a popular app where users can drop pins on the map to share hidden locations. The spot had 4 decent reviews, and someone noted they had even left a ring of stones for a campfire. A user with the name GeoExplorer47, which is absolutely the kind of username my boyfriend would make, had posted it about 6 months ago. He included a picture of the exact clearing in the woods where we were going to stay. He described it as remote, quiet, and far away from any crowds. He gave it a perfect rating and said he would definitely return. Geo had shown me this review on his phone like he had just discovered a secret paradise. The drive up there was the kind of beautiful that makes you feel briefly crazy for ever choosing to live in a crowded, noisy city. We lost the main highway somewhere around the town of Saint-Donat. After that, it was just old dirt logging roads, endless thick northern forests, and the occasional road sign written in French that Geo translated loosely as a warning about moose crossing the road. The further we drove, the more the world seemed to fall away. The bars on my phone screen dropped one by one until there was simply a warning that I had no service. We pulled into the hidden clearing around 4 in the afternoon. My trusty spreadsheet had correctly identified this as the ideal window of time to set up our camp before the sun started to go down. The clearing was exactly as the pictures had promised. It was perfect. The old fire ring was still intact, the ground was nice and flat for the tent, and there was a narrow creek maybe 30 steps to the east that we could hear flowing gently when we first stepped out of the car. I noticed the unnatural quiet maybe 20 minutes after we arrived. I was busy hammering the stakes for the tent into the ground, and Geo was doing his usual version of helping, which mostly involved standing near things and handing them to me only when I specifically asked for them. I stopped hammering for a second and stood up. I told him that it was so incredibly still out here. Geo did not answer me right away. He just whistled a low, tuneless little melody, the way he always does when his mind is totally empty and relaxed. The sound of his whistle seemed to disappear into the trees immediately. There was no echo. It was like the forest just opened its mouth and swallowed the sound whole. He finally looked around and told me it was because there were no other campers around. He said it like that perfectly. It explained everything. And for a moment I thought, yes, that must be it. There were no large families with screaming kids running around. There were no teenagers playing loud electronic music from a cheap speaker across the campground. It was just us, the tall trees, and the late afternoon sunlight cutting through the branches in long, golden columns. I took a deep breath of the fresh pine air and felt my tense shoulders drop for the first time in weeks. I finally felt relaxed. I did not notice right away that I could not hear the creek flowing anymore. Here's the thing about normal national parks that nobody really tells you until you have experienced both a busy park and the true wilderness. Normal parks are loud. They are not necessarily loud in a bad way, but the noise is always present. There is always another campsite close enough to hear people talking. There is always a child complaining about a bug, or the sound of car doors shutting, or the general background noise of human beings simply existing near each other. You stop noticing it after a while. It just becomes the natural background radiation of being outdoors. This place was completely different. By the time we had the tent fully set up and a good fire going in the stone ring, the forest around us had gone completely, perfectly, almost aggressively quiet. There were no birds singing in the branches. There was no wind rustling through the leaves at the top of the canopy. There was no sound of small animals moving through the dry brush on the ground. Even the creek had completely dropped out of earshot. I told myself that the sound of the crackling fire was just covering up the sound of the water, but deep down I knew that was not true. I asked Geo if it was always this quiet up in these remote areas. He looked up from the little camp stove where he was boiling water. He considered my question for a second. in the slow, calm way he considers most things. He told me it was probably because we were so far deep into the woods. There was no highway to create a buffer of wind or noise. There were no other people. He said out here, sound just travels away and vanishes. I nodded slowly. That made sense. Geo is very good at making things make sense. He is the calm to my anxiety. We ate our dinner as the sun dropped behind the trees, and the temperature dropped right along with it, much faster than I had expected. That is the tricky thing about late August when you go this far north. The days still feel warm and thick like summer, but the nights remember that winter is always waiting. By 8 o'clock in the evening, I had already put on my heavy fleece jacket. By 8:30, I was shivering and looking longingly at the warm tent. The darkness came in a way that I was completely unprepared for. I grew up in the suburbs, and I have lived in the busy heart of Montreal for 11 years. I know city darkness very well. City darkness is not really dark at all. It is just a slightly dimmer setting on the exact same world. There are always streetlights, glowing windows, or the orange haze of the city reflecting off the clouds. This forest was something entirely different. The campfire we built lit up maybe a 30-foot circle around us. Beyond that sharp edge of light, the forest was absolute. It was not just dim or shadowy. The world simply stopped existing. It was like looking into a black wall. I kept looking up into the dark, expecting my eyes to naturally adjust the way they always do. I kept waiting for the shapes of the trees to slowly appear out of the blackness. They never did. I wrapped my arms around myself and told him that it was so dark out here. Even to my own ears, my voice came out sounding much smaller and weaker than I meant it to. Geo just looked up from his phone screen, glanced around the campsite with a mild expression, agreed with me casually, and went right back to whatever he was watching. He had downloaded a full season of some television show before we left the city. That is classic Geo. He can be out in the middle of absolute nowhere with zero cell service, surrounded by a wall of darkness, and be perfectly happy watching a comedy show on a tiny glowing screen. I pulled my folding camping chair much closer to the fire and mentally told myself to stop being so dramatic. I heard the voice at exactly 47 minutes past 9 o'clock. I know the exact time because I had just checked the clock on my phone. I was doing the mental math in my head to figure out how many hours were left until the sun would come up. I do this every single night, whether I am safely in my own bed or sleeping out in the woods. Geo was sitting right beside me. His chair was tilted back. He had both of his earbuds in, and his face was bathed in the pale blue light of his phone screen. I had been staring out into the dark tree line without really meaning to. I was just looking past the edge of the firelight, staring at nothing at all because my anxious brain refused to shut down and relax. Then, coming from somewhere deep in the invisible trees to our left, I heard a voice. "Hello?" "Hey there." The voice was bright, cheerful, and entirely casual. It sounded exactly like a friendly neighbor calling out to you over a backyard fence. It was completely, horrifyingly ordinary. I was on my feet before my brain even registered that I was standing up. My heart slammed against my ribs. I grabbed Geo's shoulder and asked him if he heard that. Geo paused his show and pulled out one of his earbuds. He looked at me with a confused expression and asked what he was supposed to be hearing. I told him that someone had just said hello. I told him it came from over there. I pointed a shaking finger directly at the dark tree line, which was completely useless because we could not see a single thing beyond the fire. He looked in the direction I was pointing. He had that patient, gentle expression on his face. It is the look he always gets when he thinks I'm blowing a small problem out of proportion, and he needs to calm me down. He told me it was probably just another camper walking around. He reminded me that the app showed a few other clearings, somewhat near our spot. I told him it sounded too close. I told him it sounded like the person was standing right at the edge of our light. Gio just shrugged his shoulders. He said that sound travels in weird ways out in the open wilderness. He told me the person could be much further away than it actually seemed. I stood at the edge of the warm firelight for a very long moment. I just stared into the place where the light ended and the absolute blackness began. A normal person would have called back. A normal person would have yelled out a greeting, asked who was out there, or asked if they needed help. My mouth stayed tightly shut. My throat felt like it was blocked by a stone. I finally turned around and told him that we needed to go inside the tent soon. I used the dropping temperature as an excuse. I climbed inside the tent and zipped the heavy fabric shut behind me. I slid deep into my warm sleeping bag and just lay there. I listened to the heavy, unnatural silence press up against the thin nylon walls of the tent. It felt like the silence actually had a physical weight to it. Gio came inside about 20 minutes later. He was already half asleep before his head even hit his camping pillow. He was completely unconscious and snoring softly in under 4 minutes. I know this for a fact because I was counting the seconds in my head. I lay there flat on my back in the pitch-black dark, staring up at the invisible ceiling of the tent, and I waited for the morning to come just like I always do. Somehow, against all odds, I must have actually fallen asleep at some point. That almost never happens to me when I'm anxious. One moment I was wide awake, staring at the ceiling and making a mental list of all the normal forest sounds that were completely missing. The next moment, I was swallowed up in a thick, dark, heavy sleep without any dreams. And then, suddenly, I was wide awake again. I had no memory of the transition between being asleep and being awake. Beside me, Gio was breathing in a slow, deep, even rhythm. The bright fire outside must have died down to nothing but dull red embers, because the orange glow that had been shining through the tent walls earlier was completely gone. It was pitch black. I blindly reached out and checked the glowing screen of my phone. It was 13 minutes past 2 in the morning. I desperately needed to use the bathroom. I lay there for a full 5 minutes trying to negotiate with my own body, which is a very typical thing for me to do. It was freezing cold outside. It was incredibly dark. The only bathroom was the terrifying, silent woods. But the only other option was to lie there in agony for another 4 hours until the sun came up. I've tried to ignore that feeling before, and it never works. I slowly unzipped the door of the tent. I tried to pull the zipper down as quietly as I possibly could, but in that dead, heavy silence, the metal teeth sounded like someone tearing the whole world in half. The air outside the tent was bitterly cold. There was no moon shining through the thick canopy of leaves above. I reached up and clicked the button on my headlamp. Instantly, the forest jumped out of the darkness and surrounded me. The trees appeared like ghosts in a pale, narrow beam of white light. Somehow, having that one single strip of light just made all the shadows around it look even darker and more threatening. I quickly walked to the edge of the clearing. The dead, dry leaves crunched loudly underneath my heavy boots. I did what I needed to do as fast as humanly possible, keeping my eyes glued to the ground, and then I quickly turned back toward the safety of the camp. That is the exact moment I saw it. I kept trying to tell myself that I had just been asleep, I told myself it was 2 in the morning and my eyes were playing tricks on me. As I turned my head, the bright beam of my headlamp swept across the tree line on the far side of the clearing. For just one fraction of a second, the light caught a shape standing just inside the trees. It was tall, it was perfectly still, and it was completely wrong. It was not a tree trunk. Trees do not have that kind of strange, narrow vertical shape. Trees do not stand there looking like a living creature that is quietly trying to decide whether or not it should step forward. My entire body froze solid. I could not breathe. I stood there shivering in the freezing cold, with my bright headlamp pointed directly at the spot. I stared hard into the woods. I stared until my eyes watered. And as I stared, I forced myself to see only ordinary things. I told myself it was just the tree line. It was just a cluster of broken branches. It was just the natural way that dark shadows stack on top of each other in the middle of the night when you are exhausted, terrified, and your brain is working in overdrive to scare you. I started walking back to the tent. I walked very quickly. I did not run. I promised myself I would not run, because running meant I was admitting there was a reason to panic. I crawled back inside and quickly zipped the tent completely shut behind me. I slid back into my sleeping bag and lay down right next to Gio. He had not moved a single inch. His breathing had not changed its slow, steady rhythm. He was warm, he was solid, and he was completely real beside me. I squeezed my eyes tightly shut. I gave myself a strict mental lecture. I told myself I was just half asleep. I told myself I had been staring out into that creepy tree line all evening, waiting to see a monster. My brain was already primed and ready to see something scary. There was absolutely nothing out there. And for a brief moment, I actually almost believed my own lies. I was almost completely back to sleep when I heard the loud, sharp snap of a heavy branch breaking on the far side of the clearing. It was a single, clean, deliberate sound. It sounded exactly like something heavy that had been standing very still had finally decided to take a step forward. This happened roughly 40 minutes after I had gotten back inside the tent. I had been so close to calming down. I had almost convinced myself that the strange shape at the tree line was just twisted branches. I told myself the snapping sound was just a small, ordinary animal. Maybe a fox or a raccoon or a deer just walking around doing normal animal things in the night. I was tired, I was on edge, and my anxious brain was just taking ordinary woodland sounds and building horrible monsters out of them. I was just drifting off again when I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps crushing the dry leaves right outside the tent. The steps were incredibly slow and highly deliberate. Crunch, pause, crunch, pause. Something was slowly walking in a circle, all the way around our tent. I completely stopped breathing. My chest tightened in pure terror. And then I heard Gio's voice, but it was not coming from beside me. It was coming from outside the tent. The voice was low, careful, and barely above a tiny whisper. Lalitha, do not make any noise. Just listen to me very carefully. Whatever is in there laying beside you right now, it is not me. Come outside. Do not wake it up. Every single drop of blood in my veins turned to ice. My stomach dropped so hard I felt sick. Very, very slowly, I turned my head to the side. There was someone lying right beside me. The figure was zipped snugly inside Gio's blue sleeping bag. In the pitch-black darkness, I could just barely make out the shape of the face. It was Gio's face. The thing smelled exactly like Gio. It was that highly specific, familiar combination of cedar wood deodorant, and campfire smoke that I have fallen asleep next to for 6 long years. But his eyes were wide open, and they were staring directly at me. Here is the one terrifying fact that I simply cannot get out of my head. It is the thing that is making my hands shake violently as I type these words. Geo does not wake up in the middle of the night. He never wakes up. Not ever. In the 6 years we have lived together, I have never once rolled over at 2 in the morning and found him awake. He is a deep, heavy sleeper. He sleeps like a man who has never once in his entire life been afraid of the dark. So why were his eyes wide open right now? And how long had they been open? Just lying there staring at me. I lay there frozen in the sleeping bag, and I did the only thing my terrified brain could think to do. I stared hard at his face in the dark, and I tried to find the real Geo hidden inside of it. I looked for the tiny, faded scar that cuts through his left eyebrow from a bicycle accident he had when he was a little boy. I looked at the way his nose sits just slightly crooked on his face from a break he suffered in high school that he never bothered to get fixed. I looked for the real Geo in that face, the exact same way you search your brain for a word you know you have forgotten. I found all the right pieces. The nose was right. The jaw was right. The hair was right. But even with all those perfect pieces, I could not tell you with any actual certainty whether those pieces truly added up to the man I loved. Outside the thin walls of the tent, the slow, crunching footsteps had completely stopped. The thing lying beside me inside the tent had not moved a single muscle. It had not even blinked. It just lay there completely still, watching me with Geo's familiar eyes in the absolute, suffocating dark. And then slowly the thing reached its arm out of the sleeping bag. It found my shaking hand in the dark, and it held it. We lay there together in the terrible, heavy silence for hours. We lay there until the pitch-black darkness finally began to slowly turn into a dull, watery gray light shining through the nylon walls of the tent. Throughout that entire eternal night, neither of us moved an inch. Neither of us spoke a single word. And I have not been left alone for a second since we silently packed up our camping gear this morning and drove the car back toward the safety of the main highway. He is driving the car right now. He has one hand resting loosely on the steering wheel. His eyes are staring completely blankly at the road ahead. He has not turned the radio on. He has not looked at me. I keep slowly turning my head to look over at him in the driver's seat. I keep squinting my eyes, trying desperately to look for the tiny scar on his left eyebrow. Am I just being crazy and dramatic? What am I supposed to do if I look close enough and I don't find it? Story 3. For such a sweet little creature, she sure does have an appetite. The jungle is a southeast London flat. The humble victim is myself. I remain static because there is not much left to do at this point. The radiator ticks in the corner of the room, a steady metallic pulse that marks the passing of time in a way that feels almost mocking. The occasional screech of cars outside attempts to keep me focused on the world beyond these walls, but I have not moved yet, and I do not see myself doing so anytime soon. A half-finished cup of coffee sits on the table beside me, developing its own small ecosystem of mold and film across the surface. My monstrous companion stalks. She has noticed my newly found sedentary nature and has ceased her merciless cries for attention. Her new approach is undeniably stalking. There is no hope for me now. There is still hope for her, though. My darling angel will remain sustained for many months, I suppose. She began with the ankle. She was certainly aware of my current condition. Still very much alive at the time, still breathing and blinking and feeling every single thing she did. You will spend your entire life savings on a small creature, and it will, sooner or later, betray you. There is no malice in it. There never was. It is simply the nature of things. The beast must eat. I, for one, have not eaten since Thursday. I could not expect such restraint from her. Fair enough, I say, to no one in particular. The words come out dry and cracked and disappear into the stale air of the flat without making any difference at all. By the time she had worked her way up to my left knee, I considered being alarmed. I considered standing up and doing something about it. I considered screaming for help or dragging myself to the door or calling someone on my phone, which still sits on the kitchen counter where I left it days ago. Yet my bones remain sedentary, fixed in place like something dragged down by wet cement. The will to move simply is not there anymore. It left a long time ago before she even started, and now the physical ability is following close behind. Poppet is not cruel. That is the thing I want people to understand if anyone ever reads this. She is not doing this out of spite or hatred or any kind of vengeful feeling toward me. Poppet grooms the areas she has finished with. Her tongue, rough as pumice stone and relentless as the tide coming in, sends pangs of white-hot pain through my remaining limbs. The sensation breaks the silence with deep screams of agony that tear out of my throat before I can stop them. She no longer flinches at the sound of my screaming either. In the beginning, she would startle and run away for a few minutes, hiding under the bed or behind the sofa, her ears flattened back against her head. But she has grown used to it now. The screaming has become background noise to her, just another sound in the flat, like the radiator ticking or the cars screeching outside. She sleeps on my chest each night, with the full weight of her small, terrible body pressing down on me. She purrs at a frequency I have come to associate with mercy. It vibrates through my rib cage and into whatever is left of my heart, and I find myself grateful for it in a way I cannot fully explain. I am grateful that I cannot move. I am grateful that I will be sustenance for a good friend instead of rotting away alone in this flat with no purpose at all. At least this way I am useful. At least this way someone benefits from what is left of me. She often sits in the square of afternoon light that falls across the living room floor each day at 2:30. The sunlight moves slowly across the carpet as the hours pass, and she follows it, repositioning herself to stay within its warmth. I watch her do this from where I lie on the mattress, and I dream of my childhood. I grew up in a nosy neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's business and no one could sneeze without 3 different neighbors asking if they had a cold. I am sure that in a place like that, some fat nose would have eventually prodded through a letterbox to check on me. Someone would have noticed the smell or the lack of movement or the pile of posts building up on the doormat. Someone would have called the authorities and I would have been found. I am offered no such solace here. This is what I deserve for wanting to be a hotshot. This is what I get for moving to the city and cutting ties with everyone who might have cared enough to check in on me. I wanted independence and privacy and freedom from all those prying eyes, and now I have it. I have so much of it that I will disappear from this world without a single person noticing until the landlord comes around wondering why the rent is late. She is by any observable measure content. Her tail moves slowly back and forth, the way it does when she is thinking about something pleasant. I have watched that tail for years now. I know all of its moods and movements, the quick flicking when she is annoyed, the puffed-up bottle brush when she is frightened, the slow, lazy swishing when she is at peace with the world. Right now, she is at peace. Right now, she is happy. That has to count for something. I sense I am going soon. The edges of everything are starting to blur and the pain has faded, into something duller and more distant, like it belongs to someone else in another room. I suppose my presence lingers in certain ways, though. There is still an indentation on the sofa from where I used to sit every evening to watch television. The cushion holds the shape of me, even though I have not sat there in over a week now. A smaller indentation is forming from where Poppet perches to peer at me through the doorway. She checks on me regularly, coming and going between her meals, making sure I am still here and still available. I instead lie on a mattress that is soaked entirely through with entrails and the contents of one's left leg. The smell should be unbearable by now, but I have grown used to it, the same way Poppet has grown used to my screaming. The human body can adapt to almost anything when it has no other choice. The mattress was white once. Egyptian cotton. 300 thread count. I bought it when I first moved into this flat because I wanted to treat myself to something nice. Now it is a dark, brownish red with patches of other colors I do not care to identify. It tells the story of the past several days in stains and patterns that I will never have to explain to anyone. I choose not to struggle anymore. I made that choice a while ago, and I have not regretted it since. It was hard enough getting here. Getting to this point, I mean. Getting to a place where I could simply lie still and let things happen without fighting back. There is a strange kind of freedom in surrender. There is a peace that comes with accepting that you have no control over anything anymore. I spent so many years trying to control everything. My career, my relationships, my image, my future, and none of it mattered in the end. None of it could save me from ending up here on this mattress in this flat with this cat who loves me in the only way she knows how. There is not anything left to do or say. I have made my peace with the radiator and the coffee cup and the square of afternoon light. I have made my peace with the screaming cars and the silent neighbors and the landlord who will eventually come knocking. I have made my peace with Poppet, most of all. She's doing what any creature would do in her situation. She is surviving. She is adapting. She is making the best of a difficult situation with the resources available to her. I cannot fault her for that. I can only admire her for it. She yawns. Her mouth opens wide, revealing those small, sharp teeth that I used to think were adorable when she was a kitten. I remember the day I brought her home from the shelter. She fit in the palm of my hand, and she mewed so softly I could barely hear her over the traffic outside. I remember thinking that I would take care of her forever, that I would give her the best life a cat could possibly have, that we would grow old together in this flat, me on the sofa and her on my lap, watching the afternoon light move across the floor year after year. I suppose in a way that is still happening. We are still together. She is still on my lap, more or less. The light still moves across the floor at 2:30 every day. The details have changed, but the essence remains the same. Two creatures sharing a space and keeping each other company through the long, slow passage of time. I yawn, too. My jaw barely moves anymore, but the reflex is still there, somewhere deep inside whatever is left of me. The muscles remember even when the strength is gone. The body holds on to its habits long after the mind has let go of everything else. Poppet blinks once at the window. The light is shifting now, moving away from its usual spot, and she watches it go with a look of mild disappointment. She will have to find a new warm place to sit soon. Perhaps she will choose the mattress. Perhaps she will curl up beside me the way she used to do when I first brought her home, back when I was whole and warm and full of blood she had no interest in. Big stretch. Her front legs extend forward and her back arches up and her claws dig briefly into whatever surface she is sitting on. I have seen this stretch 1,000 times. It is one of the small, perfect pleasures of living with a cat. They stretch with such complete commitment, such total dedication to the act, that you cannot help but admire them for it. Deep sleep. Her eyes close and her breathing slows and her body relaxes into that boneless, liquid state that only cats seem capable of achieving. She is at peace. She is full. She is warm. She is everything I wanted her to be when I first brought her home from the shelter all those years ago. The beast must eat. That is the fundamental truth that governs all of this. That is the principle that underlies every interaction between every living thing on this planet. We consume and we are consumed. We take and we are taken from. There is no malice in it, and there is no mercy either. There is only hunger and the satisfaction of hunger, and the brief quiet moments between meals when everything feels calm and good and right. There's not much left to discuss. Poppet knows this, and I know this, and the radiator knows this, and the coffee cup knows this. We have all reached an understanding, the living and the dead and the dying and the inanimate objects that bear witness to it all. This is how things end sometimes. Not with a bang or a whimper, but with a yawn and a stretch and a deep contented sleep. I close my eyes. The radiator ticks. The cars screech. The light moves across the floor and disappears behind the buildings across the street. Poppet purrs. I am grateful. Story 4. Getting a table at the steakhouse took me 6 months the first time. It is the kind of place where money alone does not get you through the door. You need an invitation from someone who already dines there, and you need a willingness to wait. Over the last 2 years, I managed to work my way up to becoming a regular. I ate there once a month, always at the same corner booth in the back, and always ordering the same thing. The establishment was famous for its slow roasted cut. The menu described it as aged for a specific duration and prepared with a proprietary blend of spices and roasted over a very low flame for an entire day. When you ate it, the meat practically melted on your tongue. There was nothing else like it anywhere in the city or anywhere I had ever been. I arrived for my reservation at 8 in the evening, just like I always did. The maitre d' stood behind his polished wooden podium, wearing the same perfectly fitted tuxedo he always wore. His posture was impeccable, and his expression was carefully neutral the way it always was. He greeted me with a tight, professional smile and told me my table was ready. He said it was good to see me again. I thanked him and mentioned that it looked busy tonight. He told me they were at capacity as always and asked me to follow him. He led me through the dining room, and I took in the atmosphere the way I always did, even though I had seen it dozens of times before. The lighting was dim, relying mostly on candles flickering on the tables and small, recessed bulbs embedded in the ceiling that gave off just enough warm light to see by. The carpet was thick and dark, and it absorbed all sound, making the room feel like a quiet sanctuary, despite the fact that it was completely full. Politicians sat at round tables, leaning close to each other and speaking in careful tones. Local executives cut into their steaks with silver knives. Wealthy socialites sipped wine from crystal glasses and laughed quietly at things that were probably not very funny. A waiter approached my table exactly 2 minutes after I sat down. He poured water into my glass from a frosted pitcher and then handed me the leather-bound menu. He asked me if we were starting with the marrow tonight. I told him no, thank you. I said I just wanted the slow-roasted cut tonight, and I wanted it medium rare. He told me it was an excellent choice and that he would inform the kitchen immediately. I waited for 40 minutes. I drank my water slowly and watched the other patrons the way I sometimes did when I was alone with nothing else to occupy my attention. The atmosphere in the room was always identical, no matter when I came. People spoke in hushed tones, leaning over their expensive plates, completely oblivious to the world outside. There was something almost hypnotic about it, the way everyone seemed to exist in their own private bubble of candlelight and conversation. When the waiter returned, he set a white ceramic plate in front of me with practiced precision. The meat was dark, almost mahogany in color, resting in a shallow pool of its own juices. The aroma rose up immediately, and it was rich and complex and slightly metallic and completely unique to this restaurant. I had never encountered that particular smell anywhere else, no matter how many steakhouses I visited. The waiter told me to enjoy my meal, and then he stepped back and seemed to fade into the shadows of the room the way all the staff did once they had completed their task. I picked up my knife and fork. The knife slid through the meat without any resistance at all, like cutting through warm butter. I took the first bite. The flavor was as complex and layered as I remembered, deep and savory with undertones that I could never quite identify no matter how many times I tried. I took a second bite and then a third. Each one was perfect. On the fourth bite, I brought my teeth down and felt a sudden, jarring shock that sent a spike of white-hot pain through my entire lower jaw. A sharp crack echoed inside my skull, and for a moment I thought I had broken a tooth. I stopped chewing immediately. My eyes watered from the sudden jolt of pain. I raised my cloth napkin to my mouth and carefully spat the contents into the white fabric. I wiped my lips and used my tongue to carefully check each of my teeth. Nothing was broken as far as I could tell, but my gums were throbbing, and the ache in my jaw was spreading up toward my ear. I looked down at the napkin. Mixed within the chewed fibers of the meat was a small gray object. It was metallic. I could tell immediately by the way it caught the candlelight. I picked it up between my thumb and index finger. It was covered in grease and sauce, but the rigid threads along its cylindrical body were unmistakable. It was thick and less than an inch long and perfectly machined. This was not a random piece of kitchen debris. This was a manufactured object with precise engineering. The waiter appeared at my elbow as if summoned by some invisible signal. He asked me if the temperature was to my liking. I dropped the screw back into the napkin and folded it quickly. I slipped the folded cloth into my jacket pocket before he could see what was inside. I told him yes, it was perfect. Then I said, "Actually, could you bring the check, please?" I told him I had just remembered an early morning appointment and that I needed to wrap things up. The waiter frowned slightly. He told me he was surprised because I had barely started my entree. I told him I was sure and thanked him. He nodded and walked away. I sat there at my corner booth with my heart beating faster than normal. I told myself that kitchen accidents happen all the time. A piece of a blender could have broken off. A loose bolt from an oven rack could have fallen into the food during preparation. These things occur in restaurants, and they are usually harmless and embarrassing for the establishment, and nothing more. But the object sitting in my jacket pocket did not feel like a piece of restaurant equipment. Something about its weight and its precision and its size did not fit. I paid the bill and left a generous tip because I did not want anyone to think something was wrong. I walked out into the cold night air and drove straight home, with my jaw still aching dully every time I clenched my teeth. When I got to my house, I went directly to the kitchen sink. I took the napkin from my pocket and dumped the small metal object into a glass bowl. I turned on the hot water and added a drop of dish soap and scrubbed the piece of metal thoroughly with an old toothbrush. I worked at it for several minutes, making sure every trace of grease and sauce was removed. Once it was clean, I dried it carefully with a paper towel and set it on the counter under the bright overhead light. It was dull gray. The threads were deep and aggressive, designed to grip something hard. The head of the screw did not have a slot for a flathead screwdriver or a cross pattern for a Phillips head. Instead, it had a hexagonal indent, the kind that requires a specialized tool to drive. I leaned closer until my nose was almost touching the counter. Along the smooth upper band of the screw just below the head, I could see tiny etchings. They were so small that I almost missed them entirely. I went to my desk in the other room and dug through the drawer until I found a small magnifying glass that I sometimes used for reading fine print on documents. I brought it back to the kitchen and held the lens over the metal object. The etchings formed a sequence of numbers and letters, a serial number stamped into the metal during manufacturing. I sat down at my computer and opened a browser window. I typed the entire alphanumeric sequence into the search bar exactly as it appeared on the screw. I hit enter and waited. The first page of results was entirely blank. No matches found. Nothing at all. I went back to the screw and squinted through the magnifying glass again, checking each character one by one. The final character was what I had been reading as a 0, but looking at it more carefully under better light, I realized it was actually the letter O. An easy mistake to make with characters that small. I corrected the search query, replacing the 0 with the letter O, and hit enter again. 3 results appeared on the page. They were all links to PDF documents hosted on medical and industrial supply websites. I clicked the first one. The document loaded slowly. The header at the top of the page displayed the logo of a medical supply manufacturer. The page was a product catalog for surgical implants. I scrolled down through rows of photographs and specifications until I found the entry that matched the serial number from my screw. The text beside the product image read, "Titanium pedicle, screw 6.5 millimeter diameter for orthopedic application in spinal fusion procedures." I stopped breathing for several seconds. I sat there staring at the screen, reading the words over and over again, as if they might rearrange themselves into something less horrifying. Then I looked at the small gray screw sitting on my desk next to the keyboard. It was designed to be drilled into human bone, into a human spine. It was a medical implant that was supposed to be inside someone's body, holding their vertebrae together. And I had bitten into it inside a piece of meat at a restaurant. I opened a new browser tab. I typed in the name of my local area and the words spinal fusion surgery. The results flooded the page with clinic advertisements and medical practice websites and patient testimonials. I narrowed the search by adding the word news. A local news article appeared at the top of the results. The headline was dated 3 weeks ago. The article detailed the sudden and unexplained disappearance of a prominent local politician. He had vanished after leaving a fundraiser event one evening. His car was found abandoned on the shoulder of the highway with the keys still in the ignition and his phone sitting on the passenger seat. There were no signs of struggle, no witnesses, no explanation. I clicked the article and read through every paragraph carefully. The text described his background and his career in local politics and his recent voting record and his personal life. Near the bottom of the article, almost as an afterthought, a single sentence caught my attention and made my stomach drop. Sources close to the family noted that he had been recovering well from a recent spinal fusion surgery, which had required him to take a medical leave of absence late last year. I pushed my chair back from the desk. I rubbed my face with both hands, pressing my palms against my eyes until I saw spots. I told myself it was a coincidence. It had to be a coincidence. Perhaps a kitchen worker had a medical device removed at some point and somehow lost track of the hardware and it ended up in the food preparation area. Perhaps the screw had been sitting in a drawer somewhere and fell into a mixing bowl. The rational mind is very good at finding excuses when it desperately wants to avoid a terrifying conclusion. I sat in the quiet of my office for a long time, trying to force all the pieces into a harmless picture that made sense. But the image of the dark, rich meat on the white ceramic plate kept flashing in my mind. The slightly metallic aroma, the flavor I could never quite identify, the way it melted on my tongue, unlike any beef I had ever tasted. I could not sleep. By midnight, the silence in my house had become unbearable. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the screw sitting under the bright kitchen light. I needed to know the truth. I refused to call the police based on a paranoid theory, built entirely on an internet search and a piece of metal that could have a dozen innocent explanations. But I also could not let it go. I could not just climb into bed and pretend I had not found what I found. I went to my closet and put on dark jeans and a black hooded sweater and a dark jacket. I grabbed a small flashlight and shoved it into my pocket along with my car keys. I drove back toward the city center. The streets were mostly empty at that hour. Just the occasional taxi and a few pedestrians walking quickly with their heads down against the cold. The steakhouse was located in a high-end district surrounded by art galleries and luxury boutiques that were all closed and dark at this time of night. But the rear of the building backed into a long, narrow alleyway where the delivery trucks parked during business hours. I had noticed it once before when I took a wrong turn, looking for parking. I parked my car 2 blocks away from the restaurant on a quiet residential street. I turned off the headlights and sat there for a moment, gathering my nerve. Then I got out and walked the rest of the distance on foot. The air was freezing. My breath came out in thick white clouds that dissolved almost immediately in the still night air. I pulled the hood over my head and turned down the alley. The pavement was slick with frozen condensation, and I had to walk carefully to keep from slipping. The smell hit me almost immediately. Rotting garbage and old fryer grease hanging in the stagnant air between the buildings. There was no wind in the alley, and the smell just sat there thick and nauseating. I found a recessed alcove behind a large green dumpster, directly across from the restaurant's metal loading dock doors. I crouched down in the shadows and waited. 1 hour passed, then another. My legs cramped badly, and my fingers went completely numb despite being shoved deep into my jacket pockets. I checked my watch. It was 2 a.m. The alley was silent except for the distant hum of the city and the occasional drip of water from a pipe somewhere above me. Just as I decided that I was being ridiculous and that I should go home and get some sleep and call the police in the morning like a rational person, a pair of headlights swept down the alley from the far end. An unmarked white van rolled slowly toward the loading dock. It came to a stop right next to the raised platform, and the engine idled quietly. The rear doors of the van swung open from the inside. 2 figures stepped out onto the pavement. They were large men wearing dark winter coats with the collars turned up. The metal door of the restaurant opened from the inside with a heavy grinding sound. The head chef stepped out onto the loading dock. He was still wearing his white double-breasted coat and his checkered pants. He looked up the alley in one direction, and then down the alley in the other direction, scanning for anyone who might be watching. Then he nodded to the 2 men standing by the van. The 2 men reached into the back of the van and pulled out a large, dark tarp. It was wrapped tightly around something and bound with thick plastic straps pulled tight. They dragged it out onto the pavement. When it landed, it hit the ground with a dense, fleshy thud that echoed off the alley walls. The shape inside the tarp was unmistakable, even in the dim light. It was a human form. I could see the outline of shoulders and a head and legs pressed against the dark material. The chef told them to get it inside. His voice was low, but the acoustics of the narrow alley carried the sound perfectly to where I was crouching. He said the others were waiting. The two men grabbed the tarp by the plastic straps and hoisted it up onto the loading dock. They dragged it up the metal ramp and toward the open door. The chef held the heavy metal door open for them. As they crossed the threshold, one of the men slipped on the smooth surface, and the tarp swung sideways and hit the door frame with a dull impact. The chef hissed at them to be careful. He said, "Do not bruise the meat." They hauled the bundle inside, and the chef followed them in. He left the metal door propped open with a rubber wedge jammed under the bottom edge. He walked a few paces down the hallway inside and then disappeared from my line of sight around a corner. I stood up slowly. My knees ached from crouching for so long, and my legs felt like they were full of pins and needles. My mind was screaming at me to turn around and run to my car and drive far away and never come back. Every rational instinct I had was telling me to leave this alone and call the authorities and let someone else deal with whatever was happening inside that building. But a cold, hard anger had begun to replace my fear. It started in my chest and spread outward until it filled my entire body. I had eaten there. For 2 years I had sat at that corner booth and I had consumed whatever they were serving me. I had savored it. I had complimented it. I had tipped generously and thanked the waiter and driven home satisfied. If what I was thinking was true, then I needed to see it with my own eyes. I stepped out from behind the dumpster. I crossed the alley quickly and quietly, staying low and watching the loading dock door the entire time. I reached the dock and stepped over the rubber wedge and slipped inside the hallway. The air inside was warm and humid, and it smelled intensely of bleach and roasted garlic. The combination was almost overwhelming after the freezing air outside. I could hear the steady, low hum of large refrigeration units running somewhere deeper in the building. The hallway was narrow with white walls and a concrete floor that was slightly wet. At the end of the hall, I could see a set of double doors that led into the main kitchen. The doors had small, square windows embedded in the wood at eye level. Light was pouring through those windows from the brightly lit kitchen beyond. I crept down the hall slowly, staying pressed against the wall and trying to make as little noise as possible. My sneakers were quiet on the concrete, but every breath I took sounded impossibly loud in my own ears. Before I reached the double doors, I noticed a slatted wooden door to my left. It was cracked open just a few inches. I stopped and peeked inside. It was a massive, dry storage pantry. Sacks of flour and bags of imported rice were stacked on the floor. Rows of canned goods lined the shelves from floor to ceiling. The pantry was dark and smelled like dried spices and cardboard. But the important thing was that the pantry shared a wall with the main kitchen. And mounted in that shared wall was a large air return vent covered by a metal slatted grate. Through the narrow openings in the grate, I could see directly into the cooking area. I slipped into the pantry and closed the wooden door behind me as quietly as I could. I climbed carefully onto one of the sturdy bottom shelves, positioning myself so that my face was level with the metal vent. I pressed my eye against the grate and looked through. The kitchen was brightly lit with banks of fluorescent tubes running along the ceiling. Everything was stainless steel. The prep tables formed a long island running down the center of the room. Above the tables hung rows of gleaming pots and pans and massive meat hooks suspended from a ceiling-mounted rail system. 10 people stood around the center tables. I recognized the head chef immediately by his white coat and his posture. The sous chefs stood nearby, along with several members of the waitstaff, including the man who had served my table just hours earlier. They were all standing in a loose circle around the center island, not speaking, just standing there waiting. The dark tarp lay in the middle of the stainless steel surface. The shape inside it had not moved. The chef told someone to lock the doors. One of the waitstaff walked out of my field of vision, and I heard the heavy deadbolt on the kitchen entrance click into place. The sound echoed through the room. The staff member returned to the center island. They all stood in a circle around the tarp. Nobody moved to grab a knife. Nobody reached for the plastic straps binding the bundle. Nobody did anything that I would have expected to see in a kitchen. Instead, the chef reached up to the collar of his white coat. He unbuttoned it slowly, one button at a time, and let it fall to the floor behind him. The rest of the staff followed suit. Coats and aprons and button-down shirts fell away one by one, leaving them standing bare-chested under the bright fluorescent lights. Their skin looked normal. They looked like ordinary people. Kitchen workers and waiters standing shirtless in a restaurant kitchen in the middle of the night. Then the chef reached behind his head to the back of his neck. He dug his fingernails into the skin right at the base of his skull. He pinched the flesh between his fingers and pulled forward. I clamped my hand over my mouth so hard that my teeth cut into the inside of my lip. I had to physically stop myself from making a sound. There was a wet, tearing noise. The skin around the chef's neck split open, but there was no blood, no red. Just a clean separation, like peeling a label off a jar. He gripped the edges of the split skin with both hands and pulled it forward over his head, like removing a tight rubber mask. The human face stretched and distorted grotesquely as it came away from whatever was underneath. The nose flattened and the eye holes widened, and the mouth pulled into a horrible, gaping oval before the whole thing came free with a soft, sucking sound. Beneath the skin was not human muscle or bone. A creature emerged from inside the human shell. Its flesh was a pale, sickly gray, like something that had never been exposed to sunlight. Its skull was elongated, stretching forward into a pronounced, hairless snout like a dog's muzzle, but longer and narrower. Its jaw was lined with jagged yellow teeth that overlapped each other at irregular angles. The creature continued to peel the human suit down its shoulders and arms and torso, stepping out of it entirely, like someone stepping out of a set of coveralls. Its limbs were too long for its body. They folded at angles that no human joint could achieve. The hands ended in thick, dark claws that clicked against the stainless steel when they touched the table. The eyes were entirely black, with no white and no iris. Just two glossy, dark orbs that reflected the fluorescent lights above. Around the room, the rest of the staff were performing the same gruesome transformation. The wet, tearing sound filled the kitchen from every direction as 10 of these gray, elongated creatures shed their human disguises and stood revealed under the bright lights. They kicked the discarded human skins into a pile near the ovens like dirty laundry. The chef creature reached out with one clawed hand and sliced through the plastic straps binding the tarp. The thick material fell open and draped over the sides of the steel table. The body of a man lay on the table. He was older, with thinning gray hair and a soft, pale face. His eyes were closed and his expression was slack. He was wearing a dark suit with the tie loosened. The creatures moved with coordinated, terrifying precision. They approached the table from all sides and took their positions, just as line cooks would arrange themselves during a busy dinner service. Each one seemed to know exactly where to stand and what their role was. One of the creatures began to speak. The sound was guttural and harsh, like gravel being scraped across metal. It originated deep within the creature's throat, and it came out distorted and broken. But I could understand the words. It was speaking English or something close enough to English that my brain could process it. The creature said, "The marrow is thick in this one." It dragged a single claw slowly down the dead man's leg as it spoke. The chef creature replied that he fed well on his constituents. Its snout wrinkled as it formed the words, exposing the full length of its jagged teeth. It said to cut the portions small. It said the patrons prefer it tender. The creatures grabbed large cleavers and boning knives from the magnetic strips mounted on the walls. They began to dismantle the body with the same practiced efficiency that any professional butcher would use. They worked quickly, separating muscle from bone with clean, precise cuts. The sound of blades hitting the steel table rang through the kitchen. I watched in absolute horror as the same meat I had eaten hours ago was prepared right in front of my eyes. The dark, rich flesh that I had savored and complimented and gone back for month after month. I understood now what the slightly metallic taste was. I understood why the flavor was unlike any beef I had ever encountered. I understood everything, and the understanding made me want to scream. One of the smaller creatures tossed a severed limb into a large metal bin at the end of the table. As it did, it rasped out words that I will never forget. It said, "They eat the rot." It said, "The elites come to our tables, and they swallow the corruption." The chef creature agreed. It held up a dark slab of muscle and inspected it under the fluorescent light, turning it slowly in its clawed hand. It said it taints them. It said every bite they take darkens their souls. It said they think they consume power, but they consume their own demise. Another creature spoke up. Its black eyes were fixed on its work as it said the words. It said, "Making them ripe." It said when their souls are fully black, we harvest them. And the cycle feeds itself. A cycle. They were feeding human flesh to wealthy, powerful people. The act of consuming it corrupted something inside the diners, darkened them, changed them on some fundamental level that these creatures could detect. And when the corruption was complete, the diners themselves became the next meal, the next body on the table, the next course served to the next round of patrons who would eat and be tainted and eventually be harvested in turn. An endless, self-sustaining loop of consumption and corruption. And I had been part of it for 2 years. I shifted my weight on the shelf, trying to relieve the pressure on my aching knees. As I moved, my knee bumped against the stack of cardboard boxes that were balanced on the edge of the shelf next to me. The boxes slid backward with a soft scraping sound. I reached out to grab them before they fell, but my hand brushed against the large glass jar of dried peppercorns sitting on the adjacent shelf. The jar was heavy and round, and the moment my fingers touched it, the jar tipped over the edge. Time seemed to slow down. I watched the glass jar fall through the dark air of the pantry. It tumbled end over end, catching a sliver of light from the vent as it dropped. It hit the tiled floor and exploded. The shatter was deafening in the silence. Glass and peppercorns scattered across the floor in every direction. In the kitchen, on the other side of the wall, all movement stopped instantly. The chopping ceased. The guttural whispers ended. The wet sounds of butchery went silent. Through the vent, I saw 10 pairs of solid black eyes turn in unison directly toward the pantry wall. They all looked at exactly the same spot, right where I was crouching. The chef creature snarled 2 words, "Living meat." The creatures scrambled over the prep tables with terrifying speed. Their long gray limbs propelled them forward, like insects scuttling across a surface. They vaulted over the steel island and headed straight for the door that connected the kitchen to the hallway where the pantry was located. I leaped off the shelf. My feet crunched on broken glass and scattered peppercorns. I kicked the pantry door open with everything I had, and it slammed against the hallway wall. But I did not run toward the hallway exit. The loading dock door was too far away. They were already converging on the kitchen side of the double doors, and they would cut me off before I made it halfway down the hall. I needed a weapon. I needed something to fight with, or I was going to die in this building. I burst through the double doors into the main kitchen, just as the first creature came around the corner of the center island. Up close, the sight of it was even worse than through the vent, and the smell was overwhelming. A thick, putrid odor like rotting meat mixed with something chemical and acidic. It hit me like a wall. The creature lunged at me. Its jaws snapped open, revealing rows of those jagged yellow teeth, and its claws reached for my throat. I dove to the side and rolled across the slick kitchen floor. My shoulder slammed into the base of a prep station, and pain shot through my arm. I looked up. Above me hung a rack of kitchen tools mounted on the wall. I reached up and grabbed the first two things my hands touched. In my left hand, I had a heavy, square meat cleaver with a thick wooden handle. In my right hand, I had a commercial butane blowtorch, the big kind that professional kitchens use for searing sugar on desserts or finishing the crust on steaks. The creature recovered from its missed lunge and spun around and came at me again. Its claws swiped at my face, and I felt the air move as they passed inches from my eyes. I swung the cleaver with everything I had. I put my entire body into the swing, and the heavy steel blade buried itself deep into the creature's gray forearm. Dark, viscous fluid that was not blood sprayed across the white tiles. The creature let out a deafening shriek that was so loud and so high-pitched that it felt like it was drilling into my skull. It staggered backward, clutching its wounded limb. But the other 9 were already moving. They poured around both sides of the center island, cutting off every possible path to the hallway door. They hunched low to the ground on all fours, their snouts twitching as they sniffed the air. Their black eyes were locked on me. They were spreading out to surround me, and I could tell they were coordinating, preparing to swarm me all at once from every direction. I backed up until my shoulders hit something large and metal behind me. I glanced over my shoulder. It was a commercial deep fryer, a massive stainless steel unit filled to the brim with gallons of dark-used cooking oil. The heating elements were off, and the oil was at room temperature, but it was thick and entirely exposed in the open basin. The fryer was mounted on wheels, industrial casters that allowed it to be rolled around the kitchen for cleaning. The creatures crept forward, slowly closing the circle around me. The chef creature stood in the center of the group. Dark fluid was dripping from its chin where it had been feeding. It spoke in that grating, broken voice. It told me I could not leave. It said I carried the taint. I dropped the cleaver. It clattered on the tile floor. I gripped the edge of the fryer basin with my free hand and braced my feet against the floor. I pulled the trigger on the blowtorch. The blue flame hissed to life, burning violently in the still air. The light from it cast harsh shadows across the creatures' faces, and for a moment they hesitated. I yelled that I was not on the menu. I kicked the front wheels of the fryer as hard as I could, while simultaneously yanking the basin forward with my free hand. The massive unit tipped. The front edge dropped, and gallons of dark cooking oil surged over the rim in a massive wave. It cascaded across the floor in a spreading pool that splashed directly onto the legs and lower bodies of the advancing creatures. They slipped on the slick surface and shrieked and clawed at the tiles, trying to keep their balance. Their claws scraped against the floor, leaving long gouges in the surface. I aimed the blowtorch at the spreading pool of oil and pulled the trigger all the way. The flame met the grease. The reaction was instantaneous. A wall of orange fire erupted from the floor, climbing the oil-coated bodies of the creatures in a fraction of a second. The kitchen turned into an inferno. The flames roared upward with a sound like a freight train, and the heat hit me so hard that I stumbled backward. The creatures screamed. It was a chorus of high-pitched, inhuman wails that sounded like nothing I had ever heard before, or want to hear again. The fire engulfed their gray skin, and they thrashed wildly, knocking over prep tables and sending pots and pans crashing to the floor. Every surface they touched spread the fire further, as the oil in their bodies ignited everything it contacted. The hanging towels caught fire. The wooden shelves caught fire. The ceiling tiles began to blacken and curl. The heat was agonizing, even from where I was standing several feet away. I could feel it on my face and my hands and through my clothes. But the path to the back hallway was temporarily clear. The creatures had scattered away from the door in their panic. I turned and sprinted down the hallway. Thick black smoke was already billowing along the ceiling, rolling forward in dark waves. I held my breath and ran with my head ducked low. I reached the metal-loading dock door at the end of the hall. I kicked the rubber wedge out from under it and shoved the heavy door open with both hands. I burst out into the freezing alley. The cold air hit my burning lungs like shattered glass, and I coughed so hard I nearly fell to my knees on the pavement. But I did not stop. I did not look back. I ran down the alley and around the corner and down the street until I reached my car 2 blocks away. I fumbled with my keys. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped them once before I managed to unlock the door. I threw myself into the driver's seat and started the engine and pulled away from the curb. I drove out of the district and onto the highway heading away from the city center. In my rearview mirror, I could see thick black smoke rising into the night sky above the rooftops. Orange light flickered against the undersides of the clouds. Sirens began to wail somewhere behind me, getting louder as fire trucks and emergency vehicles raced toward the scene. By morning, the local news was reporting on a massive structural fire that had completely destroyed the city's most exclusive dining establishment. The news anchor read the report with a solemn, serious tone. She said a tragic gas leak was believed to be the cause. She said the fire department had determined that the blaze burned with such extreme intensity that no remains of any kind were recovered from the rubble. No bodies, no evidence of anyone being inside. The investigation was brief, and the case was closed quickly. A tragic accident, and nothing more. The authorities consider it a closed case. I know the truth. I know there are no human remains in that ash because the creatures did not burn to death. They fled into the darkness, shedding whatever charred skin remained on their bodies. They are out there somewhere right now wearing new faces and new skin suits and preparing to start again. I am writing this because I saw an advertisement online this morning that made my blood run cold. The restaurant group that owned the steakhouse has announced an expansion. They are opening a new exclusive reservations-only dining room in the neighboring state next month. The advertisement promises the same menu, the same ambience, the same legendary slow-roasted cut that made the original location famous. If you ever receive an invitation to an elite restaurant that seems too exclusive to be real, if the wait list is months long and the clientele is made up of politicians and executives and wealthy socialites, if you finally get a table and the meat they serve you tastes like nothing you have ever had before, if the flavor is complex and rich and slightly metallic and you cannot quite identify what makes it so unique, decline the reservation. Get up from the table, walk out the door, and do not look back. They are feeding you corruption. Every bite you take darkens something inside you that you cannot see and cannot feel until it is too late. They are patient. They will wait months, years, however long it takes. And when you are fully tainted, and your soul has rotted from the inside out, they will come for you. They will pull you into the back of a white, unmarked van in the middle of the night, and you will become the next course, the next dark slab of meat on a white ceramic plate served under candlelight to the next unsuspecting patron. And the cycle will feed itself. Do not eat there. Story 5. The old theater in my town had shut down years ago, though the marquee still read, "Coming soon" in fading red letters. I used to stop outside the theater on my walk home from school, peering through the glass doors and trying to imagine what the place must have looked like in its prime. The old green carpet was still visible beneath the dust and stains left behind by decades of spilled soda and muddy shoes. Near the entrance, a glass concession cabinet sat empty except for a few scattered popcorn kernels fossilized in the corners. Sometimes, if the sun hit the glass the right way, the lobby almost looked alive again. By the time November of 2010 rolled around, there was next to no one left in Green Hollow. The town was completely devoid of life. No movement, no sound, no sign that anyone had ever been there at all. Rolled-down shutters and boarded-up windows had become permanent fixtures along Main Street. Despite the town's ingrained state of desolation, there were nights when the quiet emptiness was mournfully beautiful, especially when Nora Halpern was by my side. I do not recall when Nora entered my life. She had always been there in some form or fashion. Birthdays, holidays, and summers that felt endless when we were children. We grew up side by side the way people in small towns often do, until it becomes impossible to tell where your memories end and theirs begin. Back then, loving her felt as natural as breathing. It was not until I turned 16 that I realized how desperately I loved her. Just the sound of Nora laughing from across a room was enough to set my chest aching in a way I had no name for. It was not a crush. It was not infatuation. It was something heavier and deeper and more permanent than either of those words could hold. She had become the center of everything without me ever deciding she should be, and by the time I understood what had happened, it was already too late to undo it. By the tail end of spring in 2010, bonfires had stopped being just bonfires and had transitioned into excuses to throw parties down winding back roads. Weed and vodka had replaced lukewarm beers, and nobody really bothered pretending at innocence anymore. It was around then that you learned to knock unless you wanted to see people doing things they would deny on Monday morning. Most of those parties came and went without mattering. There were usually one or two a week, and everyone knew everyone in Green Hollow, so even if you were not invited, you knew when and where it was happening. Word would spread through school by Friday afternoon, and by nightfall, half the high school would be crowded into a house somewhere on the outskirts of town. I do not remember most of them. The nights blurred together the way they do when you are that age, trying not to be alone with your own thoughts. So I showed up anyway, most of the time, because it was easier than staying home. The last one I remember clearly has stuck with me ever since. The party was at a house on the edge of town, one of those places you only notice when there is too loud music coming from it at too late an hour. It belonged to a senior named Chad Bell. Quarterback, honor roll, you know the kind. The kid that adults used as proof that the school system was still working the way they intended. I did not know him well. I did not really know anyone well at that point. But I went anyway. I pushed my way through a throng of shifting bodies that danced rhythmically to some generic pounding bass line, trying not to gag on the stench of sweat and perfume and weed and hard liquor. A few people tried to pull me aside, but I ignored them, intent on finding a drink and a corner to isolate myself in. Nora was also there. leaning against the kitchen counter with a red Solo cup in hand. She watched people dancing and writhing, half in the room and half somewhere else entirely. When she saw me, her face lit up. She said my name and smiled as I approached. She told me I had made it. I said, yeah, and that was about all I could manage. She nudged my arm with the back of her hand and told me not to look so gloomy. She asked if I was seriously telling her I was not having fun at all. I told her I was fine, just not really my scene. She said that was not an answer. I shrugged and told her not particularly. She gave me a look that was half amused and half accusing, and she asked me why I was there if I was not enjoying myself. I told her it was better than sitting at home and listening to my parents. That made her laugh. She called me a real sad sack, and I told her I knew, but I was fine. Seriously. She made a skeptical sound and took a sip from her cup, still watching me. She said, I always said I was fine. She asked if I knew that. I told her I was, and she said sure, in a tone that made it clear she did not believe me at all. A pause stretched out between us, filled with music from the living room and that terrible bass line shaking through the floorboards. Then she bumped my shoulder again, softer this time, and told me to come dance with her. She dragged me through the kitchen and into the living room, where we disappeared into the shifting mass of bodies and colored lights. The music blurred my thoughts entirely while the noise rattled through my ribs, and for a little while I could almost forget myself. Almost. Nora danced like nobody was watching her, or rather, like she did not care if anyone was. There was a recklessness to it, loose and effortless, that made everyone around her seem slower in comparison. Her hair whipped across her face as she laughed at something I could not hear, and for a few minutes, being beside her was enough. It was enough, and it always would be, or so I told myself. After a while, 10 minutes maybe less, Nora leaned close enough for me to smell vodka on her breath and motioned toward the back door. I followed her outside without a word. The porch was cold and nearly empty. Out here, the music faded into a dull pulse beneath the sound of wind moving through the trees. Somewhere beyond the yard, deep in the dark woods behind Chad Bell's house, I could hear insects humming in uneven waves. She asked me suddenly if she could be honest with me. I said yes, of course. She smiled a little at that, though it looked nervous somehow. She asked how long we had known each other. I laughed softly and asked what kind of question that was. She told me she was serious. I thought about it and said since we were kids, 10 years maybe, longer. She murmured yeah and then looked down into her cup for a moment before speaking again. She said there was something she had been wanting to tell me. My chest tightened so suddenly it almost hurt. I felt a brightness rise inside me, filling me with hope. All at once, every small thing between us over the years started rearranging itself in my head. Every late-night phone call, every lingering glance, every moment I had spent convincing myself I was not imagining the way she looked at me. She asked me if I knew I was her best friend. I nodded too fast and said yeah. She said she trusted me more than anyone. The world had already started opening beneath my feet. Then she smiled, not at me, but at the thought of someone else. She asked if I knew Joshua Mercer. She said she had started to really like him, and she thought he liked her too. Something inside me collapsed so completely and so quietly that I do not think she even noticed. She laughed softly and said it felt good to finally say it out loud. Before I could respond, she leaned over and wrapped her arms around me. She told me I was a good friend. She asked if I knew that. Friend. The word landed harder than Joshua's name had. I managed to say something. Even to me, my voice sounded distant. Nora pulled away slightly and studied my face. She asked if I was okay. I lied automatically and told her I was fine. She smiled, apparently satisfied with that answer, and said she was going to go get another drink. She asked if I was coming. For a second, I just stared at her, at the porch light caught in her hair, at the easy smile on her face, at how completely unaware she was that my entire world had just caved in around her. Then I shook my head and told her I would be in a minute. She nudged my shoulder gently as she walked past and told me not to disappear on her. Then she slipped back inside, swallowed by the music and light pouring through the doorway. And just like that, I was alone. I stayed on that porch for God knows how long. I could still hear the music through the walls of the house, the bass muffled and distant now, like it belonged to another place entirely. Behind me, the house glowed warm and alive. Ahead, the forest waited in perfect stillness. Every so often, the back door would swing open, and a wave of laughter would spill out to interrupt the brooding silence that filled the night, only to quickly be swallowed by the inky blackness of the pine trees. Nobody ever looked out and saw me there. The cold had started to settle in, but I barely noticed it. I stared out into the dark woods behind the house, thinking how easy it would be to just walk into them and keep going. Not in any dramatic way. I did not want to die or anything. I just understood how a person could disappear without ever making the decision to. It was as simple as quietly pulling away from others, talking less, listening less, showing up less, conversation by conversation, connection by connection, commitment by commitment, until there was nothing left of the relationship for anyone to reach out for. I thought about home. Mom and Dad would not notice right away, not at first. They were always busy in their own ways, working late, arguing in the kitchen, drinking when they thought I was asleep. They were the kind of absent that can be mistaken for normal life if you squint hard enough. And for a moment, standing there in the cold, I was not sure I mattered enough to them to be missed at all. I did not decide to leave the porch. Not really. One moment I was standing there. The next, I was walking past the tree line. Then I was jogging. Then I was running. Running away from that house, that deafening party, and that painful news Nora had so casually dropped into my lap. Branches tore at my sleeves while my nostrils filled with the damp smell of last year's pine needles. My footsteps thundered through the forest, punctuated by the sharp crack of crushed undergrowth. I kept moving, deeper and deeper, until the flashing lights and mind-numbing sound of the party had totally faded away, replaced by an unnatural cold and empty silence. A whirl of intense emotions was building in my chest, burning anger, bitter rejection, and a crushing loneliness that all twisted together into an unsolvable knot. A lump formed in my throat, and suddenly it took all my strength just to keep moving. Hot tears burned behind my eyes, and I hated myself for thinking it. Hated myself for wanting something she had never offered. I gasped, trying to force air back into my aching lungs. I just wanted her. She had been my best friend for years. She had laughed with me, trusted me, shared pieces of herself she did not share with anyone else. Somewhere along the way, I had convinced myself that it meant something more. That if I waited long enough, if I cared enough, eventually she would see me the same way I saw her. She did not, and maybe she never would. The thought hollowed me out. I said it out loud. I just wanted her to love me. The confession vanished into the forest, echoing through the trees. For several seconds, nothing happened, and then the silence settled after I had broken it. It was different now. It was a quiet tension that surrounded me, one that made the hair on my arms stand up. No wind stirred the branches overhead. No insects chirped in the undergrowth. No distant calls from unseen animals echoed through the trees to make this place feel normal. I managed to call out hello, the word barely more than a whisper. But in the silence of the forest, it might as well have been the cracking of a whip. Close your eyes. I whirled around in surprise, looking for who had said it, assuming someone had snuck up behind me. The voice came again, exactly as before, a silk-fine whisper on the edge of my mind. Close your eyes. A crisp, bitingly cold fog had rolled in through the trees, cutting my vision almost completely off. It was getting thicker, curling lower between the trunks, swallowing the ground in slow, patient waves. Close your eyes. My breath caught. I said no defensively, though I was not even sure who I was saying it to. I backed up a step, then another, and my foot caught on something, a fallen branch or a twisted root, and I fell elbow first into a nearby tree. Bark scraped through my thin flannel to bite into my skin, and the sudden pain brought the forest back into focus. I started to mumble something, but the thought of drunk teenagers watching and laughing bloomed into my mind, and anger replaced the confusion that had been building in the pit of my stomach. I shouted into the fog, calling out Chad's name, telling whoever was out there that if this was how they got their kicks, they should leave me out of it. I turned and ran. Panic drove me forward. I needed distance from the house, from the party, from the unbearable weight of what I had just admitted out loud. I crashed through the trees without thinking, letting instinct choose my path. Except there was no path. The forest was an endless maze of black trunks and drifting fog. Every direction looked the same. Every turn brought me to another wall of trees. Before long, I could not have pointed back to the house if my life depended on it, which it seemed like it did. The whisper came again, closer and more insistent this time, on the edge of being a command. Close your eyes. As I ran, I ventured a panicked look back. Behind me, the fog was moving in an unnatural way. Barely 6 feet away, an amorphous shape was taking form. It hovered there, not coming closer, but also not falling behind. It blended into the fog in an unsettling way that made it impossible to tell where it ended and the mist began. I shouted at it. I told it to stop. I asked what it wanted from me. It did not answer. It only said, slowly and deliberately, close your eyes, an outright demand. That was when I understood. A horrifying truth that made my stomach drop. I had no way out of this. So I did. I closed my eyes. God help me, against every instinct that screamed at me to run, to resist, I closed them. With them closed, the world thinned to a sliver before the darkness took it. I could still see, but not in the proper sense. The whiteness of the fog seemed to invade my vision, making it so I could see the outlines of trees, the now vaguely humanoid shape that stood before me, and a shimmering that marked the edge of the fog. The only sound that reached my ears was the heavy gasping of my own breath. The fog hung thick between the trees, brushing against my face whenever I moved. Its touch was feather-light, but the cold seemed to seep straight through my skin. One brush lingered longer than the others. I frowned. The sensation remained pressed against my cheek, impossibly gentle. For a moment, I convinced myself it was only a stray pocket of mist caught in the still air. Then it moved. Something traced the curve of my cheek with slow, deliberate care, and I froze completely. The touch was not painful. If anything, it was almost affectionate. Yet every instinct in my body recoiled from it. There was something deeply unnatural about the gesture, as though whatever was touching me had learned the shape of tenderness without ever understanding its meaning. Then it whispered in my mind, a feminine edge to its tone, almost motherly, but not quite. It asked me what it was that made me ache. I could not find the words. It told me I was hurting, and something inside me unraveled at that. The truth of it stung enough, but the ease with which this thing had peeled back the layers stung even more. I had fallen for Nora, and she had fallen for someone else. I told it she had broken my heart. My voice came out quieter than I expected. I told it I had been hoping she might feel the same way I did. It asked if I wished she loved me back. I said nothing. My clenched fists mirrored the collapsing knot in my stomach. It asked if I wished she pined for me. My throat tightened as I formed a response. Yes. The affirmation was meek and barely made it past my lips. The hand grew still against my cheek before falling away, and for a long moment nothing else happened. The fog drifted quietly through the trees, and somewhere far off in the distance I could hear the faint muffled thumping of that terrible dance music. Sounds of joy that belonged anywhere but here. It asked me if I was sure. I said yes. The hand returned, this time running its skeletal fingers through my hair. It told me it would alleviate my suffering. Every nerve in my body was wound like a spring, ready to snap at any moment, screaming that something was wrong, that I should open my eyes and run and never come back to these woods again. But beneath the fear, there was a small ray of light that cut through, a false hope I could imagine was real. I asked what I needed to do. The fog shifted, and for the first time I sensed amusement in its words. It told me it hungered for the formless, for that which gives life to hollow things. A chill ran through me. I asked what that meant, though I already knew. It told me to bring it the vessels, and I would have my heart's desire. The cold in my chest deepened. The hand suddenly left my hair, and its absence felt like a knife to my stomach. I hated when it touched me, but I disliked the sensation of emptiness it left behind even more. It described them, those who wander, blind but seeing, ones I would not miss in their absence. The knot tightened painfully in my stomach, but I needed to fully clarify. I said it meant people. It confirmed. Yes, of course. Love requires sacrifice. The word settled into my mind with an alarming ease. I wanted to call the idea monstrous, call it disgusting and wrong. A part of me agreed with that instinct. But there was another thought, quieter and darker, asking what every funeral and graveyard ultimately admitted. A body was only a body. Flesh failed and bone fell to rot. It spoke again, as if reading the thought forming in my head. It told me the living were only vessels. It told me they were nothing but urns, and their contents were what it desired. I opened my mouth to say something, but nothing came out. I should not have entertained the thoughts. I can admit that now. But all I could think about was Nora, the way she smiled, the way her hair curled down her shoulders, the excitement in her voice when she had spoken about Joshua. She had never once looked at me the way I had always looked at her, and somewhere beneath all the hurt, a terrible thought took root. Maybe she was worth this.